بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أحب أقول لكم لابد إن حضراتكم تشتركوا وتقولوا إذا كان حزب تكنوقراط مصر يمكنه أن يكون نائب عنكم في التدخل في التحقيقات اللي جاية، لأن التحقيقات دي فيها جزء كبير جدا بيهم مصر. طبعا عطلة نهاية الأسبوع ديت المفروض الإنسان بيستريح فيها، ولكن يبدو أن كم الأخبار الكتير اللي هو سواء من ناحية المشكلة بتاعت ترامب اللي ظهرت والمخابرات تدخلت فيها والتحقيق فتح على مصراعيه، أو المشكلة اللي في الشرق الأوسط وما يتعلق بالضربة المتوقعة الكبيرة التي قد تهدد أمن إسرائيل كما ذكرتها التقارير اللي هي لسه طالعة من ساعة. طلعت أحد التقارير وهو أقواها من CNN وترجمته صغير، يعني هو كده بتاع 9 دقايق، وقلت لابد إن أنا أتكلم مع حضراتكم عشان تقروه. باختصار شديد، الخبراء بتوع CNN والناس القدامى المحاربين حطوا تصور للي بيحصل في المنطقة هناك، وقالوا ان هذه الضربة مش هتكون زي الضربة بتاعت 13 ابريل اللي فات، لا هتكون اكبر وممكن تؤدي الى خلل في المنطقة بالكامل، مما قد يهدد أمن إسرائيل بالكامل. وبالتالي هذا التقرير أنا يعني ترجمته، حضراتكم تشوفوه وتشوفوا المذيع بيناقش الضيوف إزاي، لأن ضروري جدا تعرفوا، لأن المنطقة داخلة على معترك كبير. اتفضلوا معايا كده.
The U.S. is now sending a carrier strike group, warships, and a fighter squadron to the Middle East, bracing for a potential escalation, a further one, of hostilities as Iran vows retaliation over the killing of a senior Hamas leader in Tehran earlier this week. It blames Israel for the attack. Israel has not commented. Growing tensions between Israel and Hezbollah and Iran are also prompting a new warning on Lebanon. The U.S. Embassy in Beirut is warning Americans who want to get out of the country to book, quote, any ticket available. This as airlines begin canceling flights in and out of the country. CNN's Ben Wiedemann is in Beirut. And Ben, you've covered so many periods like this in Lebanon through the years. I wonder, as you watch events there and reactions, are folks really bracing for something big?
Yes, they are. The people are very worried that even though over the last 10 months we've had periods of high tension followed by periods of relative calm, but now this one seems worse than anything before. Now, the U.S. Embassy, in addition to telling people just book any ticket you can, they warned that evacuations for U.S. nationals in the event things get even worse could be very difficult. And back in 2006, when the airport was struck in the early days of the war by Israeli warplanes, the U.S. did manage to evacuate some of the U.S. nationals out of here, but it was quite chaotic. Now, for instance, Kuwaiti Airlines is the latest airlines to announce that it's going to stop flying to Beirut. Tomorrow, they said, is their last flight, and it's not clear when they will resume flying to Beirut. That's just the latest airline to make such an announcement. Today, we also heard from the Minister of Economy and Trade, who warned people not to hoard food. He reassured the public that there is an adequate amount of food available. At the moment, you don't really get the sense that there is panic, but there is real fear that when Hezbollah, when Iran retaliate for this series of assassinations here in Beirut and in Tehran, that this time it's not going to be like in April, where it was a very orchestrated, telegraphed strike by Iran 12 days after that Israeli strike on the diplomatic complex in Damascus. This time, it's widely believed that not only will Iran strike, but all of its allies in the region. Hezbollah, of course, and we've heard Secretary General of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, say that's what they're going to do, but also the Houthis in Yemen and various pro-Iranian militias in Syria and Iraq. So the stage is set for perhaps a very dangerous period, not just here in Lebanon, but across the Middle East, Jim.
And listen, an attack like that would inevitably set up the conditions for a response against all of those parties and yet one more cycle of violence. Ben Wiedemann in Beirut, thanks so much. So let's break down some of these developments. With me here is Andrew Miller. He's the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Israeli-Palestinian Affairs. This is a really dicey time there, which, I mean, we could say so many times in recent months and years, but particularly now. What is your expectation about the degree of Iran's response here? Because if that assessment is correct and it's going to be multi-pronged with Iran and its proxies, that's a major escalation.
Well, I think one thing to understand is that despite the successful interception of the April attack by the U.S., Israel, and partners, that was very much a perfect storm. Everything went right, which limited the damage and allowed the Biden administration to consequently limit Israel's response. Even under the best of circumstances, there's no guarantee that it will play out as cleanly. Now we have more actors involved. Hezbollah and Hamas in particular did not engage in April, and that means rockets coming from different directions. The Israeli missile defense system is incredibly impressive, but it can be overwhelmed through saturation tactics. It's an extraordinarily dangerous moment in that regard, and Iran arguably has a greater incentive to respond strongly this time because of the degree to which they were embarrassed, frankly, by the Israeli attack in their capital against a senior Hamas leader.
I imagine that one focus of these U.S. assets going into the region is to add air defense to Israel, not just about potential retaliation.
That's absolutely right. And there are two types of munitions that we're going to be concerned about. One of them are UAVs and drones. They travel more slowly, and that allows multiple interception points. They're often taken out by aircraft well before they reach Israeli borders. Missiles are more difficult. And we were very fortunate that Israel's Arrow 3 system worked successfully in April and intercepted most of the incoming ballistic missiles. But some of the warships that are being deployed alongside the USS Lincoln have missile defense capabilities, including the Aegis system, which is our most advanced missile defense shipborne platform.
Well, I think a lot of people are aware of the Iron Dome, but sometimes forget that there are multiple layers. With Iron Dome, you get Arrow way up here for the ballistics, and there's a David Sling in between. I wondered, does the U.S. have any actual influence on Israel to pull back from what you could then expect would be another escalation? Because it does seem that the U.S. has repeatedly warned Israel or tried to pressure Israel not to be too aggressive in some of these strikes it's been carrying out prior.
The U.S. certainly does have influence. The question is whether the administration is prepared to exercise all of it. The Israeli response in April was provocative, striking a facility outside of Qom near the Fordow enrichment plant, but it was relatively targeted. And that was probably a result of U.S. pressure to constrain, to circumscribe the response. In this instance, though, it's not clear that any Israeli response, even if it is limited, will be unmet by an Iranian counter-response. So the United States, the administration, will have to exert even more pressure to try to rein in the Israelis from responding, but it will depend on the circumstances. It will depend on the damage. And if this doesn't go as well as it did in April, it's going to be much harder to exercise that restraint.
If one of those missiles gets through and lands in an Israeli city, kills civilians, you can imagine the circumstances and the expected Israeli response. I wonder, there are even some Israelis who question Netanyahu's intentions and his interests. And Benny Gantz himself has said he's putting his political interests above the national interests. Does Netanyahu want a broader war?
It's unclear if he wants a broader war. What is clear is that his risk tolerance for an expanded war is much higher than we had previously anticipated. And that creates the risk of an unanticipated escalation. If he does want a regional war, and you can make the argument, as Israelis have, that he has an incentive for one, that makes it all the more explosive. it's going to be difficult for that reason because his preferences, his interests may not perfectly align with either the United States or the Israeli people, which is a terrible combination.
During the last quite remarkable and broad Iranian attack on Israel, when they sent weeks ago a number of missiles and drones at the same time, there was some discussion that Iran had communicated in advance, we're going to do something and then we're going to stop. Do you expect any similar advance warning?
It's possible, but there's no guarantee of it. There are other means through which the United States, Israel, partner countries can learn the intent of the Iranians, which would give us time to set up. But another question that is unclear, at least to those of us on the outside, is will the regional countries that contributed to and facilitated the defense of Israel in April provide the same degree of support? Yeah. Will Jordan, will Saudi Arabia permit use of their airspace? Will they deploy their own fighters? And as you mentioned before, this multi-layered defense is the key to handling this situation. It may not be possible, depending on the reaction of regional players who likely view Netanyahu's decision to target India as gratuitous and unnecessarily provocative.
Yeah, there were Arab participants in that last offense. They didn't necessarily advertise their participation, but they were central to it. Andrew Miller, thanks so much.
Thank you.
زي ما شفتوا كده التقرير مش مبشر لدرجة إن وزارة الخارجية تدخلت في الأمر بالنسبة لرعاياها اللي موجودين في لبنان. بعد أنا ما عملت التقرير في حد بيقول إن البداية كانت بال50 صاروخ اللي أطلقوا من 3 ساعات من لبنان على الشمال الإسرائيلي، بحيث إن هم غطوا الشريط الحدودي بالكامل بالنسبة للمستوطنات وضربوا مناطق مدنية، وبالتالي من المتوقع ان يعني يحصل هزة كبيرة في المنطقة في الأيام القليلة القادمة. إنما أنا من وجهة نظري أنا شايف استعراض القوة اللي أمريكا عاملاها في البحر الأبيض المتوسط والبحر الأحمر ده هيقلل من تأثير هذه الضربات لأسباب كتيرة جدا. أولا استعراض القوة ده عندك قبرص أصبحت تحت السيطرة الجوية بالكامل من أمريكا. مصر اوريدي أعلنت أنها تتصدى لأي حاجة جاية من ناحية الحوثيين. السعودية نفس العملية، الأردن نفس العملية. إذا ما فيش غير جبهة صغيرة هي المفتوحة اللي هي الجبهة السورية والجبهة اللبنانية. فالمضادات بتاعة الصواريخ والحاجات دي كلها هتشتغل من الأسطول أو الأساطيل الموجودة في البحر الأحمر والبحر الأبيض المتوسط، فهتحد من تأثير هذه الصواريخ عندما تتحرك من إيران. طيب البعض بيقول طب ما إيران ممكن ما تتحركش. لا، أنا يعني كل المقاييس بتقول إن أمريكا مش هتحرك دي كلها إلا إذا كان عندها يعني معلومات استخبارية يعني كبيرة بتؤكد إن هم بيعدوا لهذه الضربة. يعني بينقوا الإحداثيات وعشان الصاروخ يطلع يضرب أماكن محددة والكلام ده كله، لأن أنت عندك في مصيبة موجودة على أرض فلسطين محتلة. مفاعل نووي لو أصيب الكل بيبتعد عن هذه المنطقة، لأن مش هتدمر بس إسرائيل، لا، هتنعكس على شمال السعودية وعلى الأردن وعلى جزء من مصر ولبنان وسوريا. فبالتالي الكل بيحاول يخلي نطاق الضربة في أماكن لا تضر المنطقة بالكامل. ربنا يسلم أولا، لأن برضو في البعض بحط بعض كويتشن مارك إن يعني لو تدخلت أمريكا ضد إيران ممكن تنجر الصين وروسيا وتبدأ شرارة الحرب العالمية الثالثة. أنا لا أرجح هذه النظرية، لأن ما زالت هناك الأمور ما زالت تحت السيطرة مدام يمكن منع العدوان الكبير. بس مما لا شك فيه هتحدث هزة كبيرة داخل المجتمع الصهيوني. شكرا، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.